Mr. Fukuyama, so good to see you. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Would you agree that the concept of the end of history is over?
Well, it depends on defining the end of history properly. The argument that I made way back in 1989 was that there was a pattern of historical development of institutions that seemed to be leading to liberal democracy. And this is a pattern that has persisted over, hundreds of years. And it's a situation that has seen ups and downs. And so in the 1930s and 40s, we had very severe threats to democracy from communism, from fascism, but democracy survived that through the end of the Cold War. Now, if by the end of history you simply mean what are the conditions for global democracy at a particular point in time, I think that we're clearly in a very different period than we were back in 1989 or 1991. Back then, the number of democracies around the world was growing. It seemed to be the leading form of government that many people wanted to embrace. Today, it's been backsliding. So we've had a lot of reversals of democracy, including in the United States, the biggest and the oldest democracy in the world. And so in that respect, we're in a very different historical period. But I think this is important for TV Reign's listeners. Part of the argument about the end of history was that compared to all of the alternatives, liberal democracy still remain the best form of government. And I think that continues to be the case despite its recent setbacks, that the alternatives to democracy offered by Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Viktor Orban in the end are not going to lead to more successful, stable, prosperous countries. And that we have to keep that in mind as the long-term goal of all of our political action and not lose sight of the desirability of liberal democracy as, the kind of society we want to live in.
Mr. Fukuyama, obviously we understand that every person wants to be happy. And for a human being, it's much easier and much happier to live in a liberal democracy than to live in autocracies and dictatorship, with Vladimir Putin as a president, for example. But they are obliged to live their lives in these circumstances because of many reasons. But some people think that there is a main role of the US as a leader of the free world, not to combat these autocracies and not to combat people like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and others. So, would you agree with us? What's the role of the President of the United States and the United States as the biggest democratic country in this, particular moment, which is tough, obviously?
Well, I think that the United States is an extremely important country. It's the largest and richest liberal democracy. It maintains a set of security alliances around the world. It uses its economy to create prosperity for much of the rest of the world. So it's very important. And I think that one of the reasons that the situation today is much more serious than past crises of democracy is the fact that the United States has witnessed the emergence of a populist movement led by Donald Trump that is threatening to overturn some basic American institutions. And internationally, I think that movement threatens to undermine the NATO alliance, alliances with other democratic countries like Japan and Korea around the world. And if that happens, it's going to be very bad for global democracy. So I think what happens in the United States in the coming election in November is going to be very important, not just for Americans, but for everyone else in the world.
Can the U.S. fail as the leader of the free world after these elections, in your opinion?
Well, if Trump is elected, yes, of course it can fail. I think that possibility always exists. So, we Americans have to work pretty hard to make sure that he doesn't succeed.
All right. So going back to the region where I am from, and you know it perfectly well, that Vladimir Putin has occupied 5 regions of Ukraine. And there is also a huge threat of widening of this war. There are politicians who are suggesting that Vladimir Putin's plan is to occupy more and more territories, including the Baltic states, for example, starting with Latvia or Lithuania, it doesn't matter. Considering your experience and understanding of the situation and Vladimir Putin's ambitions, would you suggest that he is going wider and further into Europe?
Oh, I think there's no question that his goal all along has been to recreate as much of the former Soviet Union as possible. This project really began with Georgia seizing 20% of Georgia's territory back in 2008 and continued through Ukraine. I think the 2 countries that would be the most vulnerable if Putin succeeds in Ukraine will be Estonia and Moldova. Estonia is fortunately still under a NATO umbrella, so the risks of attacking that country will be substantial. Moldova, however, I think is going to be extremely vulnerable. Both countries have, Russian-speaking populations.
Why Estonia, Mr. Fukuyama?
is-
I'm sorry to interrupt. Why Estonia among these 3 Baltic states?
Yeah, I think all 3 Baltic states are under threat. I would just point out that when Putin gave his interview to Tucker Carlson,
oh, yeah.
he said that I have no intention of invading. It makes sense for Putin to move against Estonia before the other 2, but all 3 of them are definitely under threat. I actually think that people should worry more about Moldova because Moldova does not have any kind of security guarantee from anyone. And although it gets support from Romania, it's very, very vulnerable. It's got a very good democratic government under Maia Sandu, but it's also one that's challenged internally. You have Transnistria and so forth.
Yes.
So I think that's a clear target.
Excuse me for this question, but what do you think we should do? Not us like Russian emigres, political emigres in Europe, but us meaning the liberal world and people who do care about that part of the world and about the world in general. What should be the steps to maintain the peace, global peace, I mean, of course?
Well, I think that the most important long-term thing we can do is to arm ourselves better. We went through this prolonged period where we did not expect that NATO would actually have to meet a Russian attack. That's a real possibility. I think the Ukraine war has made clear that we have a lot of vulnerabilities. We're not producing enough ammunition, enough Patriot missiles, enough, weapons of all sorts, because we never thought we'd be in a position of having to fight a major war like the one that's happening right now. And so I think all countries need to invest more in their defense sectors. And then there's a political task. You have a group of hardcore conservative Republicans in the US Congress that are blocking aid to Ukraine. I think that actually, if everyone were allowed to vote freely, the Congress would pass Ukraine aid immediately. But the way our institutions are structured, this minority of hardline Republicans is able to block any aid whatsoever. And so that's an urgent necessity because Ukraine is running out of ammunition right now. And that's directly the result of the internal politics in Washington.
I'm just asking, is it a usual thing for a dictator, an autocrat, to go back to history and to prove that he is right, making examples from the lessons of history? What do you make of it, this Vladimir Putin's interview, and Vladimir Putin as a historian or pseudo-historian, I would say?
Well, first of all, many leaders go back and cite history as a reason for why they set their objectives in a certain way. Hitler did that. Viktor Orban in Hungary looks back with nostalgia to the large Hungarian empire that once existed, and argues that the Hungarians living in other countries outside of Hungary really should be part of a greater Hungary. So this is not unusual. It is a bit unusual to go as far back as Putin does, all the way to Bogdan Khmelnytsky and figures like that. I would point out on Twitter or X, President Elbegdorj, the former president of Mongolia, posted a map where he showed the full extent of the Mongol Empire at the height of Mongol conquest that included, most of Russia, good parts of Europe, China, and so forth. And he said, well, this justifies Mongolia taking over all of these countries today. It was very humorous, actually, and it indicates how ridiculous it is to make an appeal to something that happened, 6 centuries ago as a justification for doing something in the present.
So what do you think about him in this interview? How did he look for you in your eyes?
Well, I think that he, is really on a mission. He does see himself as a historical figure comparable to Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. And I think that that's something that many people in the West have missed, that he has this larger purpose. We had this long argument over NATO expansion, and a lot of people argued that Putin was scared by the expansion of NATO into Georgia and Ukraine, and this is why he's doing what he's doing. And I think what his speech, it's not just that speech, that's not just the interview with Tucker Carlson. He's said this on many different occasions, that he really believes that he's correcting a big historical injustice in terms of the extent of Russian territory, that any country that Russia once occupied, either Imperial Russia or the Soviet Union, is part of Russia. And, that's his ultimate goal.
Well, okay, thank you very much. I hope this happens soon.